Amen. Very beautiful, brother. Yeah.
Beautiful. Amen.
Yes. Yes. Very beautiful. Yeah. I
The
also
piano
see.
was played by my brethren here, Richie.
Okay. Wonderful. Thanks to you too, Richie. It just reminds me that we haven't had a lot of singing recently, and now that Herm is gone, those who are singers have to fill in. So much appreciated. All right. So I appreciate those of you who are also showing your cameras. I saw Brother Matt come on, Brother Joel from South Africa. Good to see you, Brother Joel. I'm glad that your load shedding schedule allows you to be on this evening. Okay, so we, Sister Amiral, I see you too. We are going to be continuing our study in the book of Revelation. And today we are going to begin chapter 18. You know that the most difficult challenge we have with Revelation is really getting the big picture. And you know, the more I understand this, the more I realize that it's not just the book of Revelation, it's life in general, but especially the Bible. The challenge we have in reading the Bible is keeping abreast of the context, where we are in the book, and what makes us know that we're at this point in the book. We lose this and we get disjointed pieces. And you know, the more I read the Bible, the more I realize that almost the entire Bible is like that. When you come to the writings of the Apostle Paul, man, he's a master of that. He starts something in chapter 1, and then he gives you a bracketed section in chapters 2 and 3, and then he returns to his thought in chapter 4. And some of the greatest joys I've had in studying the Bible is when God shows me those connections, and I feel I'm really pleased. I see that you know, the Lord is teaching me when I see something like this, and especially when nobody ever picked it up before. So anyway, we were going through chapter 17 of Revelation. And what I want us to remember is that the beginning of Revelation chapter 17, it says, I will show you the judgment of the great whore. So, in context, where are we? In context, we're at the point of the judgment, and in particular, the judgment of the great whore. So, if you're following the storyline coming down, you had the mark of the beast, chapter 13. You had the three angels flying through the midst of heaven, chapter 14. You had the harvest or the close of probation, chapter 14. Then you had the seven last plagues, chapters 15 and 16. Then in chapter 17, you know, after the seven last plagues, what is left? Just the coming of Jesus. But there's a break because we are taken back a little bit because the angel says, I'm going to show you the judgment of the great prostitute. You have seen the judgment of the world, you have seen the seven last plagues, but hold on just a minute. Let's go back. I'm going to take you back to Babylon and show you the judgment of the great whore. Why are we taken back to look at Babylon in particular? Because Babylon is a major player. Babylon has had a great impact upon what has been happening on the world. So we're not just looking at the judgment of the world. God stops and takes us back to look at Babylon in particular, because her role is so important. Now, I'm going to take a little time and just address an issue that you know, has arisen before. But as I was looking back over the chapter this evening, I thought, you know, let me just remind us of it. Babylon literally was a city in ancient in the Old Testament. Babylon was one of the wonders of the ancient world. I'm told that the gardens of Babylon, the hanging gardens of Babylon, was considered one of the seven wonders of the world in the time of Babylon. It was a magnificent place. And Babylon was a literal city, like the capital of the Babylonian Empire was the city of Babylon. But the entire empire was called the Babylonian Empire, though it had other parts. So Babylon was a city. But if you go back a little bit, I want to remind us of something. There's a principle that some people have argued about this, right? And that's why I'm going to touch on it again. When I look at the Bible, I am convicted that religious bodies are represented by women. Religious bodies are represented by women, and empires are represented by beasts. So, what is my emphasis here? My emphasis is women and beasts. It's important for us to understand this because some people are claiming that this woman represents Jerusalem and this woman represents the Vatican. The woman riding the beast represents the Vatican or represents the city of Rome. I have been, people have been making this claim. Most people, well, quite a number of people have commented on from time to time to say that the woman riding the beast represents the city of Rome or represents the Vatican. And there are a couple of reasons why they come to this conclusion. Maybe we will look at those reasons. But I want to say that for me, consistency requires that I see that these women do not represent literal cities. Now, what about the woman that brought forth the man child, the good woman over on the left here? Does she represent a city? Let's just take a moment, and I'm going to go back to the passage that talks about this woman, just to show you that this woman cannot represent a literal city. Let's go back to it's actually Revelation chapter 12, where we see this woman. In Revelation 12, it says, there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Are we talking here about a city? Are we even talking about the heavenly Jerusalem? It says the woman, she is wearing the sun for her clothing, and she has the moon under her feet. Now, I have always understood that this woman represents God's people. If you want to give it another name, you could call it the Church of God. Now, just looking at this verse here, verse 1, you could suggest that maybe it represents Jerusalem. There is a verse in the Bible, if I can go there quickly, in the book of Galatians. Let me find it quickly. If you look on the right panel, I'm going to go to Galatians, and I'm going to go to chapter 4. And in Galatians chapter 4, you see where Paul says, let me see, in about verse 26. He says, Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. Paul says that Jerusalem is our mother. So there's some justification for saying that the woman who gives birth could be the city of Jerusalem, if you want to say it literal Jerusalem. But let's go back to the left panel, Revelation chapter 12, and I'm going to show you why it cannot represent the city of Jerusalem. Look at what it says. The woman brought forth a man child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. This man child was Jesus Christ. You could say that Jerusalem above gave birth to Christ in a figurative sense. You could say that Mary gave birth to Christ in a literal sense. But what follows shows you that it cannot be Jerusalem above and it cannot be Mary. That's how we have to define who this woman is. It says, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,203 score days. Did Jerusalem above flee into the wilderness? Did the heavenly Jerusalem flee into the wilderness? The question is ridiculous, but it gives us the answer. Did Mary flee into the wilderness from Satan for 1,260 days? No. And a little further down it says in verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he was cast onto the earth, this is after Satan is kicked out of heaven. Jesus goes back to heaven. Satan is kicked out of heaven. When he sees that he is cast, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man child. Who did Satan persecute after Jesus went back to heaven? Was it the city of Jerusalem in heaven? Was it Mary? You know the answer to that. I'm just showing you clearly that this woman, to the woman were given two wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. So anyway, the point I'm making, and I mean, I think you can all, you should all be able to see clearly what I'm saying is that this woman can in no way or shape or sense be understood to be any city. It's clear that the woman that was persecuted is the Christian church. It's the church of God that brought forth the Messiah. Jesus was a product of the church, and the church is the bride of Christ. So the woman represents the church. So the woman sitting on the beast, to be consistent, you can't say this woman over here represents a religious body, and this woman over here represents a literal city, right? If we are consistent, woman represents something, woman represents the same thing. So the good woman represents a good religious body, which is the body of Christ, which is the church of Jesus Christ. A prostitute woman, a loose woman, must represent the great counterfeit, the great false body. So this woman, I conclude, cannot represent a literal city. And then you have the so you have the principle: religious bodies are represented by women. If you have a religious body or a religious group in the book of Revelation, God represents it as a woman. And if you have a political empire, God represents it as a beast. Now, let me continue to build on that just a little bit before we go any further. And I think at this point, let me remove the images so we can talk face to face a little bit.
So, Brother David,
Yes,
so therefore the false prophet cannot be religiously false prophet then. Otherwise it would have been a woman.
exactly, exactly. Right. So, yeah, by that same principle. So, here's a point I want to make now. Here's an important point, and I think this is the first time I'm making this point, but it may not seem as important to the rest of us, but I see it as an important point. Now, in the Old Testament, Babylon was not primarily a religious, was not recognized primarily as a religious body. What I'm saying is that in the New Testament, Babylon is primarily a religious entity, not a political entity. Yet in the Old Covenant, Babylon was primarily a political entity. Notice also, this is the point, in the Old Covenant, were God's people primarily a religious entity or primarily a political entity? If you think about it, you will see that God's people in the Old Covenant were primarily a political entity. The battles that Israel fought were not religious battles. They fought battles against the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Amorites. Those were political battles. It was one nation fighting against another nation. In the typology of the Old Covenant, God's people were a national group of people. God's people were those who had Jewish blood and were a part of the nation of Israel. They were not those who were born again. So in the Old Testament, we are looking at political enmity. So the great political enemy of Israel was Babylon. Babylon was the great archetypal enemy, but it was an enemy in a political sense. So when you come to the New Testament, when you come to the book of Revelation, we are looking at the same enmity between Israel and between Babylon, but now it changes. Now, in the book of Revelation, the issues are not political anymore. The issues are religious. God's people are now a people who are, some people don't like to use the word religion, but I can't think of a better word to use to refer to things that are based on spiritual faith. Religion, we call them, right? So the issues in Revelation are religious. This is why we don't fight wars. This is why we don't care what nation we belong to. This is why we don't support political parties, because our battles are spiritual battles. Our kingdom is not of this world. We're fighting in the great ideological battle between good and evil. Our kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. It's not about politics. It's not about physical armies. It's not about physical countries. It's not about physical conflicts. Now, there are political powers described in the book of Revelation, but God's people is not one of them. So why are they even brought in the book of Revelation? It's because they become tools in Satan's hand for trying to destroy and to overwhelm the spiritual life of God's people. The political powers are to be used to try to wipe out our religious faith. That's Satan's first purpose through the beast and his friends. Okay? Satan is interested in killing us if he can't get us to change. But the first step is to persecute, to try to cause us to deny our God. That's the first step. And so that's where the political powers come in. But the great corrupter and the greatest danger is not the beast, because the beast will make Christians stronger and it will make non-Christians stronger in their anti-God basis. The beast is a dividing element. But what is a danger is Babylon, because Babylon waters down the faith. Babylon corrupts the faith by producing the wine of Babylon and making everybody drunk, and it deceives Christians, and it has the people of God in captivity. So Babylon is the real great danger as far as spiritual life is concerned. And so this is why God, after we talk about the 7 last plagues, God says, hold on a minute. Let's go back and look at Babylon, the greatest enemy of all, and let's see if we can understand Babylon. So that's where we were in chapter 17. God showed you the union between Babylon and the beast. And God shows you how Babylon has worked to corrupt the world and to corrupt the beast and to spread her deceptions. And then he makes us know that at the end there's going to be a disagreement. The beast and his helpers, the 10 horns, are going to turn against Babylon and are going to attack and destroy Babylon. God makes us know. So remember what God is showing us. He's showing us the judgment of Babylon. And so that is why he tells us that the 10 horns are going to hate this woman. Now, Babylon is said to be, if we go back to the Bible, Babylon is said to be that great city. If you go back to, let's go back to Revelation 18, Revelation 17. It says, and the woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Now, some people have made a point that I just want to try to clarify. I think Brother Ian had asked me this question a couple of weeks ago, and I never got around to answering it. But here's what they say. They say the woman represents a city, and God tells you that the woman represents the great city. And so what they say is that if God tells you that it represents a city, you can't say it represents a church, because God already says it's a great city, and you can't have a double interpretation. Like you said, a woman represents a religious body, and that religious body represents a great city. So they say you have an interpretation that the woman represents a religious body. That's one interpretation. And then you have to go interpret the interpretation and say that the religious body represents a city. So you have to go to a second interpretation in order to understand who the woman is. But we already looked at and we already compared these two women. And what we have seen is that based on the context of what we are looking at, this woman, the one on the left, cannot represent a city. And therefore, reasonably, the one on the right cannot represent a literal city either. So how do we explain that? Why do we have a double interpretation? Well, God says that the woman you saw, that is the one on the right here, God says that this woman is that great city that rules over the world. Now, he does not say it's not a religious body. Remember what I said earlier on. Babylon in the Old Testament was what? It was a city. It was a literal city. Babylon in the New Testament is what? Babylon in the New Testament is a religious entity, but this religious entity is described as a city. In other words, what is a city? A city is a place where multitudes of people congregate. So when God says it's a city, he's not saying it's a city. He's using Babylon, ancient Babylon, the city, to convey the idea to our minds of what modern Babylon is. It's a place where multitudes of people find their habitation. Not literally, because we're not dealing with literal places in the book of Revelation. We're dealing with the great spiritual dwelling place of vast numbers of people. And where you have numbers of people congregating in vast numbers, it's referred to as a city. That's where people congregate, right? Jamaica has a population of, I think, about 2.8 million. And nearly 25% of those people live in the city of Kingston, in one city. 25% of the population of Jamaica, roughly, live in the city of Kingston. You know that when you talk about New York, I forget how many millions are there, maybe from 10 to 30 million. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out of the top of my head. But cities are places where you have vast numbers of people. So God is referring to this religious institution as a city. It's referred to as a great city because God is using a parallelism of ancient Babylon, the city. And God is helping us to understand that modern Babylon is also a place where multitudes congregate. That's why it's called a city. It's, in terms of the religious issues, it's a vast collection of humanity. So that's my explanation
David,
of why you have this seemingly double interpretation. Now
Brother
let's go
David,
back. Yes, Brother Matt.
you mind if I just add a comment?
Sure, go right ahead.
Maybe the figure of the woman is not a representation of a religious body, because as you said, and also in Ezekiel, it's Israel is spoken of as a woman, as a young girl brought up and grows into a woman. Maybe it's just the mother or the birthplace of a nation, that represents God's people, and the other one is a representative of Satan's, or the secular people, the two opposing principles and governments, those two systems. So maybe it's just a mother, the birthplace of these two, represented as the birthplace of these two systems.
Sure, Brother Matt. The reason why I have this focus on actual religious entity is because of what happens to this woman on the left here, okay? Because remember, it says that the woman, the dragon persecutes the woman. So you have to ask the question, who did Satan persecute? Then after Satan was cast out to the earth, he made furious persecution against the woman, and God provided a place for her in the wilderness. There is hardly any way that you could think of to interpret this other than by looking at what Satan did after Jesus went back to heaven. He persecuted the Christian church. And furthermore, it goes on to say that this woman is persecuted for 12 60 days, at times and a half. So you see an extended period where somebody is attacked by Satan. And the only possible interpretation that I can think of, there's nothing that we can think of other than his attack upon the Christian church. So that is why that alone makes me able to give a clear identity to this woman. And then I can use that as a template to look at the other woman. And I'm saying that if, based on how you interpret the woman on the left, the good woman, consistency will lead you to take the same approach in looking at the other woman. Now, this is where now we go to chapter 18. And in chapter 18, it says, after these things, after which things? After the things we saw in chapter 17. I saw another angel come down from heaven having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. Now, hold on a minute. We just saw the 7 last plagues. Then we saw an angel, he stopped the action and he says, hold on, let's go back and look at the judgment of Babylon. Then he says, after these things now, an angel comes down from heaven with great power, and the earth is lightened with his glory. When does this take place? It cannot be after the 7 plagues. It's not after the 7 plagues. So you have to go back and think this is just before the judgment of the great whore. Remember, the angel says to John, come and I will show you the judgment of this great prostitute. So when you see the angel coming down with great power, we have gone back. How far back do we go? We go back to just before the 7 last plagues, because the 7 last plagues encompasses the judgment against Babylon. Because it says here in chapter 18, her plagues will come in one day. So when the angel says, let me show you the judgment of Babylon, he's focusing on the time of the 7 plagues. So this angel coming down goes back to before the 7 plagues. And what do we see before the 7 plagues? We see the 3 angels' messages. Chapter 14, the 3 angels' messages comes just before. And I'm sorry, I should really have I don't want to take the time and go and search now to see if I can find my images. I wanted to have on the screen an image of the entire outline of the book of Revelation, so I could take you chapter by chapter and show you. Let me see, do I have it? No, that's not what I want. All right, I'm not going to take the time to search now. I should have looked for it before we had the meeting. But I'm saying things, I'm talking about things, and I know I'm trying to use my mouth to give you the picture. So what I'm saying, I wish I had the picture before me, so you could follow me more easily. But anyway, it's Revelation 14, the 3 angels' messages. Revelation 14b, the harvest. The earth is divided into two parts. That's after the 3 messages, right? Revelation 15 and 16, the 7 last plagues. At this point, God pauses and he says, let's go back in time. Let's go back and look at the judgment of the great whore. So chapter 17 takes you back. And where do we go? We go back to before the plagues. Because when the plagues start, it is the judgment. So if he says, let me show you the judgment, and then you see that when you are about to see Babylon judge, you see an angel come down from heaven having great power, and the earth is lightened with his glory. This is the time of the 3 angels' messages. Instead of 3 angels, we are given everything under the symbol of 1 angel. But notice that it says he has great power and the earth is lightened with his glory. This is not talking about after the 7 last plagues. It's not talking about after the mark of the beast crisis. It is the point when Babylon is about to be judged, and that is right before the plagues, during the time of the 3 angels' messages. And I'm going to show you why I'm so sure of it. Look at verse 4. I'm going to come back to it, but let's read it. Let's go ahead and read it. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. When is that message given? You cannot give that message after the 7 last plagues. It's way too late at that time. This message to come out of Babylon is during the time of the 3 angels' messages. And if you go back in time, if you go back to chapter 13, you will see that it is during that time. Let's go back to chapter 13 here in the right panel. You go back to chapter 14, I'm sorry. Chapter 14. Look at what the second angel says. The second angel says, and there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. That's the second angel's message. And it's the same thing you find this angel saying over here. This angel who comes from having great power. He cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. It's the same second angel's message. Can you see that? There followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city. So you see that the message here in Revelation 18 is the same message, second angel's message. In Revelation 14, it was divided into three. One of them said the hour of his judgment is come, remember, and we are looking now at the judgment of Babylon. The second one said Babylon is fallen, and the third one warns against worshiping the beast and receiving his image. It's three messages, but in Revelation 18, everything is given to us as one great message. So, what I'm interested in and what I want us to focus on at the start here is that this angel comes down from heaven. All right? It's something to remember, brothers and sisters, that whenever you see an angel coming down from heaven, it means that this is a message that has divine credentials, divine authority, and divine power. An angel comes from heaven. I make this point because all the time I keep saying, you know, we can initiate revivals. We can. All my life as a Christian, I've always wanted to. Have told you, I thought I had delusions that I would finish the work of God. But one of the things I've learned as I've grown older is that there are certain moments in the history of the world when the God of heaven sets about to bring about a massive change in the circumstances of the religious world, and nothing can stop it. One of those was the time of Noah's flood. Another time was the coming of the Messiah. When Jesus came, he came in the fullness of the time. Nothing could stop his coming. Nothing could overthrow his mission. Nobody could kill him before time. This was a work, a divine work. It never depended upon the Israelites. It never depended upon the disciples. It didn't depend upon the apostles. It was a work that God did to intervene in the history of mankind to fulfill his great purposes. There are moments like that. I believe that the day of Pentecost was another such event, and I also believe that the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles and the blowing of trumpets are other similar events. It's when God steps in and God says it's time for a great work, and I'm going to initiate it. Now, this is why I believe that you can't make the revival, the great revival, until God's time comes. You can't make this angel come down from heaven. You can't do this. It's God's divine appointing. And the best we can do is to keep the oil burning in our lamps and to keep ourselves connected to the Lord. And day by day, we do what he puts in our way. We keep on doing the work that he gives us to do. And one day, when the time comes, then he will take us to the next step. It also says that this angel has great power. Now, I believe that this power has to do with power in our preaching, that when we share the message, it has a power to convict, to shake up people and to change their lives. But I also believe, based on Joel chapter 2, that we will also see great and mighty miracles through the power of the Spirit of God. I mean, today, through faith, we see miracles, okay? But we don't see, and many times we are disappointed. We don't see some things that we expect to happen. And I think that this is also, we don't have the capacity or the ability to push ourselves beyond a certain point. It is also a divine work when this great power comes down. And it says, the earth was lightened with his glory. This is tremendous. This is amazing. Because this world where there's AI and where there's the internet and there's social media, and this world where there's so much deception and so much human development to confuse the mind and to titillate the senses, nothing seems to be able to break through. I was thinking the other day about what can I do? Can I write another track? I've written a few tracks in my lifetime, and we have gone out and given out millions, I think millions of tracks. And I was wondering, can I write another one? And then I'm thinking, what the last few tracks we have written, we go out on the streets and we hand them out. Nobody responds. Nobody pays any attention. If you go out on the road and you stand on the roadside and you get a public address system and you start preaching, one or two few little stragglers may pay some attention to you. The masses go back and forth. They don't care. Yet the Bible says that something is to happen. something is to happen, and it is not humanity. The Spirit of God is going to work mightily, and it says the earth is to be lightened with the glory of God. That means you and me, brothers and sisters, something inside of us will compel the masses of humanity to pay attention. They may not accept what we are saying, but they won't be able to ignore it. They will either accept it or they will hate it, one or the other. So that's a promise that God makes. That's something we can anticipate. And in the meantime, we keep the flame burning. We keep the oil in the lamps. Don't allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the prevailing iniquity. The primary message of this angel, I want you to notice the primary message. Yes, it's the mark of the beast. It's the hour of God's judgment. But look what he says here. He cried mightily with a strong voice. Why a strong voice? Because maybe up to this time, the voices have been feeble. Every now and then I go on Facebook, I see somebody put up a graphic with a picture of the Tower of Babel, and they say, Babylon is falling, come out of her, my people. And they're calling people from the Roman Catholic Church, or they're calling them from the Adventist Church, or they're calling them from the Sunday keeping churches. Every now and then somebody puts up a graphic and they say, come out of Babylon, my people. Brethren, it's a feeble voice. It's a feeble voice, barely above a whisper. Nobody pays any attention. Now and then you might have somebody who gets convicted, but the voice is extremely feeble. The Lord says that when it's time for this message, there is a strong voice, mightily given. I'm not saying this to discourage anybody from making those efforts. We still have to keep on doing the best that we can to reach people. But I'm saying, don't mistake our feeble efforts for what is to come. God has something in mind. And yes, it may be that we ourselves need to be more in line with his purposes, but we cannot create something that God has not created. We don't have the capacity. We're not creators. So the angel cries mightily with a strong voice, and he says, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. Now, this statement is taken straight from the Old Testament. And let me see if I can bring up the statement. The exact one I'm looking for. Let me see. I think it's Isaiah chapter 13. There's a place that actually says the word fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. No, it's not chapter 13. I don't want to take the time to go and look for it here now. But all right, here it is in Isaiah 21. And behold, here cometh a chariot of men with a couple of horsemen. And he answered and said, Babylon is fallen, and all the graven images of her gods he hath broken unto the ground. What I'm trying to show you is that the Old Testament, the book of Revelation, it has a lot of language in it, which is almost directly from the Old Testament. And because of this, there is a temptation for us to say, whatever it means in the Old Testament is what it means in the New Testament. But remember the difference. The Old Testament was a political kingdom. It was a city. It was a physical entity. The New Testament, we are talking about a spiritual entity. So when Babylon was fallen in the Old Testament, it meant that Babylon had been literally destroyed. Babylon had been destroyed, overthrown in battle. But when it says this in the New Testament, we're not talking about a political entity. We're not talking about an entity that goes out to fight a war that is to be overthrown by political or military might. When it says that Babylon the Great is fallen, it is referring to a spiritual entity. So we must be talking about a spiritual fall. So when it says Babylon the Great is fallen, it's showing you a depth to which Babylon has reached. It says it has become the habitation of devils, and the hole of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. You also find that this is reflected in the Old Testament too. If you look, for example, in Isaiah 34, verse 14, look at what it says about Babylon, ancient Babylon. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. There shall the great owl make her nest, and lay and hatch, and gather under her shadow. There shall the vultures also be gathered, everyone to seek, everyone with his mate, everyone with her mate. So it's talking about Babylon, ancient Babylon, becoming a place, a resting place for unclean birds, vultures, owls. And so that's what God says here of this Neo Babylon, modern Babylon. Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. It's become the dwelling place of devils, the hole of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. So God is using language here very similar to what was used in the Old Testament. What he's really saying is that Babylon has reached a place where it is no longer fit for any human being to dwell or to inhabit. It's become a ruin. It's become a place where the only beings that can feel comfortable there is devils and foul spirits, because that's how low Babylon has been degraded. Now remember, what I want you to remember is that we're talking about some kind of religious institution, religious, a conglomeration of religious entities. We're talking about entities whose focus should rightfully be God, whose worship should be focused on God. But God says that this place, the only thing that can be comfortable here is devils and evil spirits. This shows you that something that ought to have been for the glory and honor of God has been completely devoted to the honor of his great enemy, the devil. And why has she fallen? It tells you why. For, because all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. Now, this is why she has fallen and why she has become the dwelling place of these evil things. The word for here, this word for, is telling you that we're about to get the reason. It's explaining why Babylon has fallen. It says for. So how do we understand this? Well, why did Babylon fall so low? Because of the wrath of her fornication. The word wrath here means the wrath of her fornication. It means the consequences. Because of her fornication, because she has committed fornication with the kings of the earth, and she has made worldly alliances, Babylon has produced a wine. She has produced a wine, and you know what wine is. Wine is something that you drink. It's an alcoholic liquor, and when you drink it, you lose control of your senses. You become disoriented. You don't know. You don't have proper balance. You become unable to relate to life in a perfectly sober way. So this is what has happened to the people who have been involved with Babylon. They have become drunk because here's the thing. It's perfectly natural. And I'm going to tell you. Let us say I'm a Christian. I'm supposed to be a Christian minister. I'm a Christian minister, okay? I start making my friendship with let us say I start getting involved with politics. Sometimes I really wonder what would happen if the prime minister or any of those politicians came and wanted to have some kind of service and they wanted me to come and to participate. And I wonder how I would respond. I mean, they never will, because I'm in the world, in the politics of this world, I'm nobody. We don't have a massive body for them to fawn over, a lot of voting people. We don't. But sometimes I wonder how I would respond, because when you begin to mingle with a certain set of people, let me give you an example. It's better to give an example. The Governor General of Jamaica was the president of the West Indies Union of Seventh-day Adventists. He was the president of the union. That is the highest ministerial position in the Adventist Church in the Caribbean. He was the head of the West Indies Union of Seventh-day Adventists. It was while he was in this job that he was offered the position of being Governor General. The Governor General is the person who represents the King of England or the Queen of England at that time in Jamaica. He represents the Queen of England. That means that he is theoretically higher than the Prime Minister, right? He is the voice of England in Jamaica. So he was asked to be Governor General, and he accepted the post of Governor General. He has become a tool in the hand of the government. He attends these governmental services on Sabbath. He has to. The fact that he's a Seventh-day Adventist doesn't matter. He has to do the duty of the job he's called. He gets a nice salary because of it, but his teaching, if he teaches anymore, I don't think he teaches anymore. He just visits the churches, right? But his religious perspective has to change drastically because of the position where he finds himself. And that is the problem with the Babylonian system that is riding the beast. The understanding of religion and of God's requirements has to change to suit the friends that you are keeping. It's like when I was a young man, I was supposed to be a Seventh-day Adventist. Well, I wasn't a Christian, but on Friday nights I would go out with my friends. I made friends with the boys in the community. We moved to a seaside village, and I joined in heartily with the life of the village. And every Friday night I would leave the home and go out in the bushes to play poker with my friends. I had to adjust to suit my friends that I was mingling with. And because of that, my religious perspective began to change. I began to believe in evolution. I told myself I was beginning to believe that God was somebody from outer space. I read a book that gave me that idea because I wanted to believe it, because I wanted to justify my position. And that's what happens when you mingle with the wrong company. I don't know if it's a Jamaican proverb that says, if you lie with dog, you will rise with flea. You rise with fleas. I guess that's not a kosher thing to say in the context of how people love to lie with their dogs in certain countries. But in Jamaica, they say, lie with dogs, you will rise with fleas. And, so what it means is that the company that you keep is going to infect the way you think and the way you teach. And that is what happens to the institutions that represent Babylon. They mingle with the political entities, and so their theological understanding changes, evolves to meet the ideas of the people they are mingling with. That's what God says. So because of this, and this is why you can see clearly, as I said, that this great message, it occurs before the seven plagues, because it's the last call. It's God's last call. I heard another voice from heaven. This again emphasizes that this is a mighty, powerful movement that is taking place. It's a heavenly movement. It's not something that you get excited because you have been watching other people, or you get excited because there's some disturbance that goes on somewhere. This mighty movement is because the Spirit of God is doing a mighty work. A voice from heaven says, "Come out of her, my people." That is a message that is filled with deep meaning. Why? Because it shows you that up to this point, God's people, a lot of God's people, are still in Babylon. So what are we to understand from this? In different religious bodies all over the world, there are still people who belong to God. There are still people who are in darkness. There are still people who are committed to their institutions and their organizations. Why are they there? Because their eyes have been somewhat blinded. Because the wine of Babylon has somewhat made them drunk. They are disoriented, but their hearts are pure towards God. They have not seen the full implications of what they are involved with. And so at this time, with this great power and with the mark of the beast, this is why I think, I am of the opinion, and I'm very strong in this opinion, that the mark of the beast will enter these religious institutions. And that is why this message will have such a power. Something is to get into the churches. Something is to enter the churches and to enter the other religious groups. Something is to be accepted by these groups that will make God's people recognize something is drastically wrong. So the message from heaven will have a great impact. All those who make excuses and they say, let the wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. All those who make excuses and they say, there have always been people in God's church who gave it a bad name. All those who make excuses and say the church has faults, but I'm going to stick with my church. All those who make those excuses, if they are honest people, they will see beyond a shadow of doubt that it is time to get out. You cannot remain there and remain untainted, because God says if you do, you will be partakers of her sins, because you will imbibe her spirit, you will take her attitude, and you will become what she is, and therefore you will receive of her plagues. So this is God's final call to come out of Babylon. It's the final call, and this is why you can see that this takes you to just before Babylon is to receive the plagues. It's just before they destroy Babylon, and that must be during the time of the three angels' messages. Because after the three angels' messages, it's the end of probation. It's the harvest of the world. So this is just before the close of probation and the seven last plagues. So God says to his people, come out of her, my people. It's the last call. And what we can understand is that there is to be a great exodus out of Babylon. You can see that God is using the language of the Old Testament, but the interpretation is different. So it says that you receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So what will God do? God remembers the iniquities of Babylon. The sins of Babylon have reached heaven. I really wonder when I see this, what kind of sins has Babylon really committed that it reaches unto heaven? But I think what God is saying is that I've been observing how Babylon, how this institution, these people who claim to be my representatives, how they have dishonored my name, how they have deceived people, how they have let down the kingdom of God, and God has remembered it. And what does God do? If you go back to chapter Revelation chapter 17, yes. Let's go back to Revelation 17 and just look quickly at what God says here to explain what he means when he says he has remembered her iniquities. If you go back to Revelation 17, it says now down at the bottom in the right hand panel, it says concerning the 10 horns which shall hate the whore, eat her flesh, make her desolate, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. It says, for God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his will. So just like Babylon was a tool that was used, ancient Babylon, to punish Israel. So God has permitted these 10 kings to develop this mind and this spirit that they will destroy Babylon. It says God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his will. And what is his will? It says her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So God has, you could say that God had prepared these 10 kings in a sense, in a manner of speaking, because he permitted them to develop. And one of the purposes he had in mind was that they were to be a tool to punish Babylon. Now, for the rest of this chapter 18, what we have mostly is a description of the kind of experience that Babylon goes through as she faces her judgment. And we could probably read through quickly because there are some details here, but a lot of it, as I pointed out, is simply quotations from the Old Testament. God uses the Old Testament language and he describes what is happening to Babylon. A lot of it looks like a physical thing, but when you understand it, it's not physical. There's a spiritual application. Now, he says in verse 6, we'll read a bit more before we pause for the evening and then we pick up again next week. In verse 6, he says, reward her even as she rewarded you. So God is saying that Babylon is to be punished in proportion to how she has dealt with God's people. And double unto her, double according to her works. In the cup which she has filled, fill to her double. This is a principle of life, that the same measure that you meet, Jesus says, the same way in which you have dealt with other people, you are to be dealt with. It's a principle of life. It's not just God actively doing this to Babylon, it's a principle that is embedded in the way God created the universe, that you receive in proportion to what you have given. He says, how much she has glorified herself and lived deliciously. So much torment and sorrow give her. For she says in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. And so, you know, for the most part, I mean, we talked about this last week. For the most part, the religious the religious part of humanity has had a massive effect on the world in a negative way. The religious masses of the world, they have enjoyed for the most part a privileged status in almost every society from the beginning of human society until today. Priests and ministers and the clerical class of people have always been deified and glorified and highly adored in every society. If you are seen as a holy person, there are always the masses of the people who have adored and been willing to support these people, even sometimes when they have been blatantly false deceivers. And when this kind of attitude has been institutionalized into churches, into these great denominations, they have the most magnificent buildings in the world, great cathedrals and halls of worship. They have the most financial support, because people believe that giving to these institutions is a way of guaranteeing a place in the life to come. So anyway, this is how God describes it. He says she has glorified herself and lived deliciously. And in the same way, so much torment and sorrow give her. And I can understand this, all right? I can understand this. Again, it's another principle of life. Somebody who has grown up, like as you said, with a gold spoon in his mouth or her mouth. You can think of a woman who never washed a spoon from the day she was born. She grew up with a gold spoon in her mouth. She has lived with servants and so on. And somebody has made her bed. Somebody has tidied up behind her in the bathroom. When she has wanted clothing or food, she just called her servant. And one day, she loses everything. One day she loses her house, she loses her money, she loses her clothing, she loses her servants, and she has to go out there and toil for herself. One thing that happens to people like this many times is that they don't even take care of themselves properly. Like, they don't know how to wash, they don't know how to cook, and nobody will pay any attention to them. And so they suffer extremely, because they're not like the poor sufferers, like you and me, who know how to handle ourselves in life, right? We can cut the grass, we can wash the clothes, we can cook dinner, we can do something to help ourselves. So when hard time comes, it doesn't bother us that much. It's like sometimes I hear people in certain countries complaining that they can't get, let's say for example, they can't get apples or they can't get lettuce, and it's like it's a catastrophe. And somebody who lives in another country like Africa, certain parts of Africa, or maybe in some parts of the Caribbean, they haven't seen an apple for a couple of years. They haven't seen lettuce for most of their life. So the person who is accustomed to living a certain way, to be deprived in the slightest way, is a terrible catastrophe. And that is why the principle is there. In the same way that she glorified herself and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. Babylon is going to be looted and raped. They are going to take away everything from Babylon. I believe they're going to take away the properties that these organizations own. They are going to freeze their funds in the bank. They are going to disband. They are going to make their meeting together illegal. I think that Babylon is going to be completely devastated. And the people who have depended on Babylon, they won't have a clue what to do or where to go. God says, Therefore shall her plagues come in one day. And I think again, I think here when it says one day, I mean it comes in upon her rapidly. You know, normally when disaster comes, you have a little time to prepare. You have um you have a foreboding, you have a premonition that something is going to happen, and you start making preparation. But God says our plagues come in one day. And that is like what happened to Job. In one day, he lost his cattle, he lost his 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 sons, he lost his daughters, he lost everything in one day. I think that's what God is saying. Babylon is getting not getting any warning. In a brief moment of time, her friends turn against her and they loot and rape and devastate Babylon. So her plagues come in one day: death, mourning, famine, everything is gone. And she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. Now, when it says she shall be utterly burned with fire, again, you are tempted to believe that this is a physical institution, because how can you burn something that is not physical? But again, remember, you're in the book of Revelation, and I'm going to go back and show you why you have to be careful when you're dealing with Revelation. If you go up to Revelation 20, I don't even need to go to Revelation 20, but let's go there anyway. It says in Revelation 20 that death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. There it mentions fire. And if you think that this means literal fire, you haven't been attending these meetings, because we saw that you can't throw death into a fire. Death is not something you can pick up and throw into a fire. You can't throw hell into the fire. Hell is the grave. And yet the Bible says they were thrown into the lake of fire. And you know, we have seen, examining other verses, that the lake of fire is simply a figurative expression. It's not a literal place. It's an expression that means the end of existence. If your existence comes to an end and you no longer exist, you are said to be in the lake of fire. And that's where everybody ends up. Whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Everybody ceases to exist, including the devil. The devil that deceived him was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. The devil ceases to exist, where the beast and the false prophet were also cast. So when you see that it says that Babylon shall be utterly burned with fire, don't think that it necessarily means it's a literal place that is going to be burned with fire. In my understanding, it simply means that to be burned with fire was let me see if I can find it. It was a sentence that was reserved for a prostitute. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Maybe I can't find it, but there is a statement in the Bible that says that a woman that was a prostitute, and it was proven that she was a prostitute, especially a woman who had a husband and she was having illicit relations with another man, she was to be burned with fire. Now I don't see it here in my reference, so I'm sorry, I don't have the time to go and search for it again either. But it's there, and if somebody can find it, I would appreciate it if you just put it in the chat. All right. So it's references from the Old Testament. God is giving us the imagery from the Old Testament, so we can make the connections that what we are looking at is the judgment of a prostitute. So the destruction of Babylon is not only that she's being destroyed because she has made everybody drunk. She's also being destroyed because she's meeting the destiny of a prostitute, of a woman who has been unfaithful to her husband. So that's what all of these little references, these little statements are intended to bring our mind in that direction and tell us how God is viewing this spiritual entity and how God is relating to this spiritual woman. It's all a part of the whole process of helping us to understand who Babylon is. It goes on to say, and the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. Now, it's a little challenging because you say, who are these kings? Because obviously it's the 10 kings. It's the 10 kings. All right, Brother Tony says Leviticus 21, verse 9. Thank you, Brother Tony. Let me see if I can bring that up here quickly, since we mentioned it. All right. Leviticus 21, verse 9. I'll bring it up in the right panel so we can look at it and we can see the connection. 21, verse 9. Yeah, here it is. It's one of those terrible verses in the Old Testament, but we're not going to look at the reason for this at the moment. But it says, okay, and it's not just any woman, it's a daughter of a priest. And the daughter of a priest, of any priest, if she profane herself by playing the whore, she profaneth her father. She shall be burnt with fire. All right, so you can look at this and make a comparison with the verse here in Revelation. She shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. And it gives more meaning to where you see God says up here. God says, her sins have reached unto heaven. Because God specified that if it was the daughter of any priest, it was supposed to be, a priest is supposed to be somebody who is dedicated to God. So the daughter of the priest should be similarly dedicated. And she profaned herself by playing the whore. It says she profaned her father. So you can imagine that Babylon's behavior is a disgrace to God. It has disgraced God. And that is why the wrath against Babylon is so decisive and so forceful, and so it is such her condition is such an abhorrence to God. So it says the people who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her. It seems like even in the world there's still some kind of sympathy for Babylon, but it's the 10 kings who initiate this destruction, the 10 kings that are a part of the beast system. They are the ones who will hate the whore, eat her flesh, make her naked, and burn her with fire. But it seems like in the world there are still some of the leading powers who remember the good relationship they had with Babylon, and they are mourning for her, and they are lamenting for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. So all of this, I believe, is a symbolic representation. God is giving us a graphic picture, and we look at it and we understand what are the spiritual implications. Now, it's a 4:45. We have been about an hour and 15 minutes going. I'm going to stop at this point at verse 9, and next week we will pick up. So I'm going to leave some time here now for questions, and also I feel like I need to take a break. So it's a double reason why I'm stopping, brothers and sisters. So at this moment, are there any questions or any additional points, thoughts anybody wants to add? All right. It's always a very pleasant feeling when I don't get any questions, because I feel like um, I was able to get my points across. I I I, I don't think it's
David,
because yes, Sister Susan, go ahead.
what was Aeon saying about the false prophet not being what we thought when you were talking about?
He was making the point that the false prophet, most people, or at least when we were committed to the Adventist interpretation, we had the idea that the false prophet was a religious institution, because we were taught that the false prophet was Protestantism in America. And so the point that was made that a beast always represents a political power. So he was using that to say, so it's clear that the false prophet, which is a two-horned beast, cannot be a religious entity. It has to be a political entity. That's the point he was making.
Okay, I got you. I thought he was asking a question. Okay,
Okay,
thanks.
all right.
David,
Yeah, Brother Ray.
I've just got a question. When you mentioned that Babylon is going to be punished according to her doings, and, Babylon has been very treacherous. Are we talking about the people that have lived unrighteously and have done wrong to make others suffer, that they will suffer longer than others?
I don't think anything like that is mentioned in this particular passage, but I know you're making reference to what happens in Revelation 20 when the wicked are destroyed. And your question, if I'm perfectly frank, is based on something that Ellen White says. Ellen White says that those who have committed the greatest atrocities against righteousness, against the cause of God, are going to burn the longest of all, and that Satan himself will burn longer than anybody else. To say that this is true or not true, I am absolutely disqualified to say, except for something. Okay, I'm going to tell you why, what my perspective will be. My perspective is that I understand the character of God, and I understand the principles on which God operates. And on that basis, I am skeptical about something like that. Why? Because revenge is a human trait. It's not a divine trait. God does not. The people who are lost, they have had an opportunity for salvation, but in a sense, they are victims. They are victims. They all were born onto a planet that was lost in sin. The wickedness that these people do is primarily and first of all because of how they were born. Now that everything is over and God has settled the great controversy and sinners are to be destroyed, what purpose in the universe does it serve to deliberately preserve the life of people to make them suffer longer? This is not God's way. I refer to something that I did when I was younger and I was, less sensible. I mean, I hate to be tormented by mosquitoes. I mean, sometimes they come, and if in former days, if I caught a mosquito, I would kill it slowly, right? I would pick off the legs and maybe pull out the proboscis, torture it a little bit because they come and bite you and make you feel so uncomfortable. And once or twice I did something like that, and it caused me some amusement. But that is me. That's a human being. That's before I came to consider and understand God's character. When something when something torments you, it's because of nature. It's not because, and even if there's some kind of inherent wickedness in people, it's because of we are victims of this planet. We are victims of Adam's heritage. So why punish people? What God wants is to get sin out of the way. He's not trying to frighten anybody to become a Christian because that time is long past. So, in my opinion, people are going to suffer in proportion to what they have done. Like I pointed out, right? If you have lived a certain way, certain consequences affect you more than other people. I believe that people who live in comfort and luxury, when the time of trouble comes, they are going to suffer more than the people who have had hard lives, right? The man who is accustomed to hardship, he has been accustomed to cooking on a wood fire. He will dig a potato out of the ground and eat it raw. That has been his lifestyle. When these delicate people have to have their corn flakes and their everything, their buttered bread and everything, and they have to go to common, ordinary digging in the ground for your food, it's going to be 10 times worse for them. So I think something is harder for some people simply because of the way they have been accustomed to live. So that is natural to the way life is. But I really do not accept, I can't accept the idea that God deliberately tortures people longer than other people in some kinds of perverse justice. I don't see justice there. I don't see any need of it.
Question, David.
David. I didn't realize. My apologies. I didn't realize this was denominational teachings. I guess I might have heard this from my dad. He was a pastor. When you have the table talks and things. But thank you so much. I thought it was in the Bible.
Okay, Brother Rick. Yeah, Brother Joel.
I have a question attached to that. Why then, if there is no desire to punish, but by God, why are the daughters of the priests in the text that you just read burned? It's a particularly hard way to die,
Yes.
unless there is something egregious that requires some form of punishment to make a point. Why burn the daughters of the priests when
Right.
they yeah.
It's not just that. The entire Old Testament is filled with those kinds of harsh punishments. I mean, there are so many things in the Old Testament that you could ask a similar question about. Why was a man picking up sticks on the Sabbath stoned to death? You know, why when you wiped out certain nations, you kill the animals. I mean, there are things that seem unreasonable, irrational, illogical, and the best way I've been able to explain those things is to be very focused on the fact that the entire Old Testament was a teaching tool. It was a system of type and antitype. Now it seems, I mean, I know that this seems to be a hard thing, that in order to teach a lesson and to make sure that the lesson was properly taught, God caused people to be burned alive or to be stoned. To be honest, I don't know if effectively anybody was ever burned. Effectively, I don't know if it ever happened. The sentence was there, but I don't know if it ever happened, because if you know that this was going to be the sentence, how many daughters of priests do you think would go out there and commit whoredom? So maybe it was never carried out, right? But I know that on one occasion, I think it was Judah who ordered his daughter-in-law to be brought out and burned because she had played the whore. And actually, according in the Bible, it was he who had gone to her, but she had disguised herself, so he didn't know, and so she never ended up being burned. But what I'm saying is that there are lessons that God wanted to teach, and I think that sometimes we don't fully get the impact of some of these lessons. And so to teach these lessons, God established harsh punishments. And yes, it's hard for a person to die by burning, but I'm going to try to put it in context, right? How many Christians died by burning during the Dark Ages? Probably hundreds of thousands. How many Christians were set alight by Nero and they were burned in his garden? So the point I'm making is that in a harsh age, the things that have become unspeakable to us in our 21st century were almost like commonplace and normal. During the Dark Ages, you knew that if you became a Christian and the Catholic Church caught you, you were caught by the Inquisition, you're going to be tortured, you're going to be burned alive. Yet you took that step. You knew and you expected it. When you read some of the stories in the Bible, you know, who was it? What was his name? Jehu. Was it Jehud? The left-handed Benjamite went in unto the king, what the king named, and pushed a knife in his belly till it came out on his back. A fat man. You read about Jael, the righteous Jael. The Sisera came into her tent and she put him to sleep and drove a nail right through his head. And for us, these are horrific stories. They were commonplace and normal. It was like putting a gun and shooting a man today. It was like putting a person in the electric chair. So what I'm saying is that sometimes things that appear horrific to us is because of how our time has changed. But in a certain culture and a certain setting, it was not so harsh and not so unusual. And I know that maybe, some people might think this is not a perfectly satisfactory answer, and maybe it isn't, but it helps to answer some of the questions for me. That's the best I can say, Brother Joel.
Well, I know that you're tired, David, and I can see that. I don't want to get you to speak more than you already have. And we've been blessed by what you've had to say today. I know I have. But is there a presentation you would have by any chance that speaks of an understanding of the justice of God in the dispensation of grace? How we should understand justice then, as a principle of God in the dispensation of grace?
I know that I have a presentation that is entitled The Greatest Parable, where I try to look at the Old Testament in a broad way and try to understand some of the things that happen there. I know that there is another presentation entitled Type and Antitype, where I try to focus on it. But there are so many presentations where I've tried to look at the true character of God and the justice of God. I don't know if I can put my hand on one that addresses that particularly. But those two presentations, I mean, are where I try to find some way of justifying what happened in the Old Testament.
Could you just repeat that again for me one more time, the names of those two presentations?
One is called the greatest parable, and the other one is called type and antitype, or type versus antitype.
All right. Thank you very much, David.
Okay, Brother Drew. All right, beloved, maybe,
Question.
yes.
When you're speaking about Babylon, who specifically are you talking about? Because I just recently heard a minister talk about saying that Rome is only Babylon and the SDA church cannot be Babylon. So who specifically?
It's a question that to justify what I'm going to say takes a while, but I'm going to say it anyway, Brother Tony. Maybe I can't justify it fully this evening, but Adventists teach that Babylon is Rome, and that she has daughters. And this is the preferred interpretation of Adventists. My understanding of Babylon came from A.T. Jones, or that's where it started. A.T. Jones helped me to understand that, helped me to focus on the idea that in Revelation we're not looking at physical structures. In Revelation, we are looking at spiritual entities. So A.T. Jones basically said, look at the spirit of Babylon rather than to focus on a particular institution and to say this institution is Babylon. So he went back to the Tower of Babel and he said, this is where Babylon began. And he looked at the principles behind the building of the Tower of Babel. They made a name for themselves. They wanted to centralize, and they wanted to be in control of people. He looked at all the characteristics of Babylon. And so Babylon, as it began at the Tower of Babel, was the root of all false religion. It began at the Tower of Babel. And so Babylon, in principle, is all false religion. So it's not this particular institution, like Adventists say, the Catholic institution, and it's not the Wesleyan Church or the Lutheran Church, and it's not the Adventist Church. It's all religion that has maybe the primary mark of Babylon is they seek to build a name in this world. They institutionalize, and they are in a relationship with the kings of this world. Those are the marks that God points out in Revelation 17. So for Adventists to say we're not Babylon, I mean, they are taking a very limited point of view of what Babylon is. But as it's better to understand the principle. If it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It may say I'm a cow, but it's a duck. So that's the way I would respond to Adventists.
That makes so much sense, Brother David. That makes so much sense.
Thank the Lord, Brother Donovan. Listen, keep the flame burning, keep the oil in your lamps, keep close to the Lord. No matter what happens, this is the root and the ground of everything. Keep close to the Lord. Everything else will fall in place.
We know not the hour of the Master's appearing, yet signs are foretell that the moment is nearing, when he shall return. 'Tis the promise most cheering, but we know not the hour. There's light for the wise who are seeking salvation. There's truth in the book of the Lord's revelation. Each prophecy points to the great consummation, but we know not the hour. We watch watch and we'll pray with our lamps trimmed and burning. We'll work and we'll wait till the Master's returning. We'll sing and rejoice, every omen discerning, but we know not the hour. He will come. Let us watch and be ready. He will come. Hallelujah, hallelujah. He will come in the clouds of his Father's bright glory, but we know not the hour. But we know not the hour. Yeah, we know not the hour. Yeah, no, we know not the